section, or at least a good part of the opening section of this book. And then I want to invite you to keep your Bibles open in whatever format that means, if they're actual printed Bibles or if it's something electronic. If you'll just stay there in Job, I want to come back to some of the other parts of the book a little bit later. We begin at the beginning of this chapter, and I'd like to invite you to stand with me as we read God's Word together. Beginning with verse 1 of chapter 1. There was a man named Job who lived in the land of Uz. I'd like to live in a land called Uz sometime. Wouldn't that be cool? Where do you live? Uz. He was blameless and a man of complete integrity. He feared God and stayed away from evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 teams of oxen, and 500 female donkeys, and he employed many servants. He was, in fact, the richest person in the entire area. Jump over to verse 6. One day, the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan the accuser came with them. Where have you come from? The Lord asked Satan. And Satan answered the Lord, I have been going back and forth across the earth, watching everything that's going on. Then the Lord asked Satan, have you noticed my servant Job? He is the finest man in all the earth, a man of complete integrity. He fears God and will have nothing to do with evil. Satan replied to the Lord, yeah, Job fears God, but not without good reason. You've always protected him and his home and his property from harm. You have made him prosperous in everything he does. Look how rich he is, but take away everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. All right, you may test him, the Lord said to Satan. Do whatever you want with everything he possesses, but don't harm him physically. So Satan left the Lord's presence. A little bit later, a second test is offered, and the Lord gives Satan permission to do with Job's body what he wishes, but just not take his life. I like the phrase that we read. Have you considered my servant Job? This is the word of the Lord. You may be seated. Being the profession that I have been now for close to 30 years, having had opportunities to talk to people on a regular basis about spiritual things, I have come to understand that the vast majority of people, even the vast majority of people in the church, couldn't give a rip about theology. Now, I know that that doesn't include you, because you all are very theologically astute and very much on the ball when it comes to theology. But you might, if you're honest, harbor in your heart the same comment that I heard from a student one time when I was teaching a course on theology. And I asked the question, what is theology? And this one student raised his hand and he said, isn't theology where you do a lot of thinking about theoretical things that don't really have any practical application? And I said, that's how a lot of people think. Yeah, actually he did pass, believe it. Whether you realize it or not, and I'm one of those people who's incredibly sensitive to this, probably one of the reasons why I am in the profession that I'm in. If you are paying attention, you may discover that you have much more theological consideration going on in your life than you realize. You may, whether you realize it or not, be dealing with theological issues day in and day out. I contend that it is our theology. It is what we think about God, which is really the word theology really means words about God. That's really what it means. We have internal conversations about God. We have internal theological conversations all the time, whether we realize it or not. Now, some of us don't necessarily have the same theology. Some of us have disagreements. Some of us think one thing and some of us think another thing, and oftentimes those things don't go very well together. Now again, I know that doesn't happen here. So I'm talking about everybody else. It's amazing where theological issues will show up. This happened a couple weeks ago. A theological dilemma, a theological conundrum, I love that word, presents itself out of nowhere as the result of something my wife did as she was driving to work. She was driving down 82nd Street from our house, and as she was getting closer and closer to Council, all of a sudden she sees this movement. She stops, she looks, she discovers that the movement is a little boxer puppy. A boxer puppy. Now, if you don't know me, and most of you don't, I grew up with boxers. I love boxers. We had a boxer until she died. We have 2 boxers now. Love boxers. I was actually in the bathroom getting ready for the day, and all of a sudden I hear our 2 boxers going bananas in our living room. I step out from the bathroom and look out just in time to see my wife come through the bedroom door, boxer puppy in hand. And all of a sudden I understood why our 2 boxers were going nuts. Thankfully they were in their kennel. Otherwise, I may be talking about a dead boxer puppy. We began the process of trying to figure out if anybody was looking for this dog. My wife actually took the dog, she actually took her car and drove all the way around the neighborhood while my daughter and I took care of the dog. Looking, stopping, asking people that were out if they were looking for a dog. Nobody had a dog. Now we realized very quickly that there was no way we could hang on to that dog. And so she just decided, after my daughter gave the dog a bath, my wife decided to take the puppy to her office, which she works here at Southwestern Christian University, right up here on Rockwell and 39. As it transpired, one of the women there in the school was in her office shortly after she arrived and was trying to figure out what she was going to do with this boxer puppy. Just so happens that this woman and her husband and their family had been looking to get a boxer puppy. And so one thing led to another, and before you knew it, this woman takes the boxer puppy home. Now, we're still trying to make sure that somebody's not looking for this puppy. We're keeping our eyes out. We're looking for signs. We're looking to see if anybody. We called the cops. We called the animal shelter. We called boxer rescue. We wanted to make sure somebody wasn't looking for this puppy. Meanwhile, Wendy, my wife's co-worker, was probably praying that the owner would not come forward. If you don't know anything about boxer puppies, they are very expensive. They're a class breed. Well, one day led to 2, led to 3, finally a week. And we didn't see anything. We never got a call back from anybody. We figured that probably somebody lost the puppy, didn't know it. Maybe they let the puppy go. We don't know. But as it turns out, Wendy and her family now have a boxer puppy named T-Bone. It was interesting, though, in the conversation she had with my wife, she used this phrase. It's almost like God answered our prayer. And my wife, being my wife, responded back, that means in order for God to answer your prayer, he had to take the puppy away from somebody else. Theological dilemma. I think one of the greatest temptations that we all face, it doesn't matter who we are, one of the greatest temptations we all face is to think that the universe revolves around us. This is particularly true in Oklahoma when it comes to driving. I won't go there. It is natural. It is kind of sort of how we're wired. The only thing that we have is us, really. It's a natural thing. Now, it just so happens that we have a theological understanding of what that is. And sometimes we can get so self-absorbed and self-consumed that, as my friend Harold will like to say on a regular basis, the self can become a predator. But it's not uncommon for us to think that the world revolves around us. It happens to you. I confess it happens to me. I think it eventually happened to Job in our story. And it happened to a young man by the name of Aaron. Aaron was a recent college graduate, brand new, wife in hand. He and his wife set out for Chicago so that he could attend Trinity Evangelical Seminary in the Chicago area. He was called into ministry, and he was going to Trinity to prepare for a life of ministry as a pastor. They left a little bit before school started so that hopefully he could find a job. His wife had already gotten a position, so they knew that they could live there, but they also knew they couldn't survive on one salary. So he began the process of checking everywhere he could possibly check for some kind of a ministry position in the city. Chicago's a big place. Hopefully something would open up. And his prayer all the way along was, Lord, put me where you want me. Put me where you want me. Put me where you want me. Great prayer. But 1 week led to 2 weeks, led to 3 weeks, and suddenly they were up against the beginning of school, and bills were now starting to come due, and he realized he had to have some kind of employment. He knew he needed to have a flexible schedule because he was going to be in school. So he bit the bullet and did what he really didn't want to do. He saw an ad in the paper. This was back before the internet, by the way. He saw an ad in the paper advertising from the Chicago Transit Authority for bus drivers. And so he went ahead and applied. Sure enough, one thing led to another, and they hired him. He was trained. He got his CDL license. He did everything he needed to do, and he became a bus driver for the CTA. Now, it's not an uncommon thing, as I understand it, for the CTA to take the newbies and to put them in the worst routes. And sure enough, with Aaron, he was stuck in South Chicago. Some of you know what that means, others of you don't. Let's just say, it ain't good. Within the first week that Aaron was running his route, he realized he was going to have an issue. There was a gang that basically ran that particular area where he had his routes. And the very first day, they got on the bus, they didn't pay, they terrorized the passengers, they tore up the inside of the bus. And Aaron realized that there really wasn't much he could do. This went on day after day, week after week, until finally he had had enough. One day, as the gang members started getting on the bus, Aaron stopped the bus and said to them, you guys either pay or get off, or I'm going to call the cops. They essentially told him what he could do with that. So he pulled around the corner. He saw a cop cruiser. He stopped the bus, got out of the bus, went over to the car, told the police officer what was going on. The police officer got on the bus and said, you guys either pay or you get off right now. So all the gang members paid and stayed on the bus. They stayed on the bus all day, until it was time for Aaron to bring the bus back to the CTA warehouse. When he turned the corner to head toward the bus barn, the gang members overtook him, yanked him out of the bus, beat him literally within an inch of his life. Here's this young man. All he ever wanted to do was to serve God. All he ever wanted to do was to please God. And now he finds himself laying on a sidewalk in the middle of the night, in one of the worst parts of Chicago, bleeding, broken, barely alive. You can imagine the questions that began to pop up in his mind. I would imagine that Aaron probably never would have presumed to equate himself, to align himself, to say that he was like Job. But I imagine that the questions that were running through his mind that night, and the questions that were running through his mind in the next few days and weeks as he began to recuperate, were the same kind of questions that Job asks. We're not going to take time to look through the whole book of Job. But if you ever take time to study it, you'll see that what happens is that Job has these wonderfully high moments of confidence in God and these terribly low moments of not completely sure what is going on. He asks some very hard questions of God. Questions like, what have I done wrong? Why don't you show up? Why don't you tell me what I did wrong? Why don't you give me a chance to defend myself? What's really great is when his buddies show up. And they start telling him, well, you must have done something wrong, man. Otherwise, you wouldn't be going through this. And time after time, he continually says to these guys, I didn't do anything wrong. I don't know what is going on here. I don't know why I'm going through this. Evidently, God has abandoned me. In the middle of all these questions and all this turmoil that's going on in Job's life, his kids are gone. His property is gone. His wife is even on her way out the door. His body is broken. He's sitting on an ash heap, practically naked outside of the city, scraping his sores with broken pottery. And the dogs are coming and licking his sore. I mean, this is not a good situation. And he just wants to know what's going on. If you'll turn with me to the 38th chapter. Finally, God speaks. I want to just run through these next few chapters. I just want to take the first verse of each section. So if you will, just follow along with me. God speaks, finally. After all of this dialogue, after this tremendous drama takes place, God finally speaks out of the whirlwind. And he says this. Who is this that questions my wisdom with such ignorant words? I love this part. Brace yourself, because I have some questions for you, and you must answer them. Verse 4. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you know so much. Verse 8. Who defined the boundaries of the sea as it burst forth from the womb, and as I clothed it with clouds and thick darkness? Verse 12, have you ever commanded the morning to appear and caused the dawn to rise in the east? Verse 16, have you explored the springs from which the seas come? Have you walked about and explored their depths? Verse 19, where does the light come from and where does the darkness go? Can you take it to its home? Do you know how to get there? Verse 22, have you visited the treasures of the snow? Have you seen where the hail is made and stored? Verse 25, who created a channel for the torrents of rain? Who laid out the path for the lightning? Verse 28, does the rain have a father? Where does dew come from? Verse 31, can you hold back the movements of the stars? Are you able to restrain the Pleiades or Orion? Verse 54, can you shout to the clouds and make it rain? Excuse me, that was 34. Can you make lightning appear and cause it to strike you as you directed? Verse 39. Can you stalk prey for a lioness and satisfy the young lion's appetites as they lie in their dens or crouch in the thicket? Beginning of chapter 39. Do you know when the mountain goats give birth? I love these questions. One after the other. Are you the one who makes the hawk soar and spreads its wings in the south? Is it at your command that the eagle rises to the heights to make its nest? Chapter 40. And the Lord said to Job, do you still want to argue with the Almighty? You are God's critic. But do you have the answers? He continues on through chapter 41. Question after question. Question after question. Crocodile makes the water boil with its commotion. It churns the depths. The water glistens in its wake. One would think the sea had turned white. There is nothing else so fearless anywhere on earth. Of all the creatures, it is the proudest. It is the king of the beasts. God is covering all the bases with one single thought. Let's be clear. I'm God. You're not. It is the answer that answers nothing and answers everything. In trying to understand the overall point of Job, which is something that I've tried to do for many years, I am indebted to an unlikely source. I don't know how many of you might be aware or might be familiar with the work of Herman Wouk. He's written several novels, many of which have to do with World War II. He wrote a novel, The Winds of War, and then also a sequel to that, War and Remembrance, both of which have to do with what was going on in World War II in both the Pacific and in Europe. There's a storyline in War and Remembrance. There's a Jewish author who basically grew up and walked away from his faith, but finds himself trapped in Europe and eventually in a concentration camp. And through the entire process, he returns to his faith. He embraces the fact that he is a Jew. He's in a concentration camp, and the whole camp has gathered together for a night where they usually spend time singing and having shows and skits, and he usually lectures. But on this particular night, they've received word that they're going to be shipped out to one of the major concentration camps where they already know that they're going to be exterminated. And so the meeting is somber, and they're all sitting there, and Professor Jastrow gets up to speak, and he says, I'm not going to lecture tonight. I want to talk to you about Job. And he goes on to give an incredibly insightful, very Jewish interpretation of a very Jewish story. And it makes perfect sense to me what he says. He writes that Professor Jastrow, looking at all these individuals who know they're about to be shipped off to their death, he begins to talk about the suffering of Job and how Job is like them. He gets down to the end of his speech and he says this. In the final analysis, what this story is about God saying to Job, this problem of evil that you've been dealing with, this problem of evil that you've been trying to find answers to, this problem of evil is my problem. And here's what I need from you. I don't need you to find the answers. I need you to believe and be my champion. Several years ago, Philip Yancey, who's another Christian writer, wrote a series of articles on the book of Job, and he said something that has stayed with me. He says, what's amazing about the book of Job is this, that at just the moment when Job thinks that God has abandoned him, it is the precise moment when Job has God's undivided attention. And I think Woke is right. I think what this whole book is about God looking for a champion. See, one of the dangers of what happens when we become consumed with ourselves, folks, is that we kind of lose sight of God. Not only God and his perspective, not only God and what he can do, but also the fact that sometimes God has needs. Oh, that sounds like a scary heretical thing that I just said. I don't mean that God is deficient. What I mean is that God has created us to be beacons of faith, to be connected to him, to be people who reflect his glory in this world. And when we become so consumed with ourselves, especially in the tough times, it's so easy for us to simply become users, not realizing that God not only is calling us, not only has he enabled us, but he's hoping that we will be his champions. Because I'm absolutely convinced that there is nothing more powerful than when those of us who claim a faith in God are going through the worst possible times of our lives, and yet we still believe. And in those moments, if Job is any indication, we can have the absolute confidence that we have God's undivided attention, and He is closer to us than He's ever been. Somewhere in the process of his healing, that truth must have dawned on Aaron. In fact, he told Chuck Swindoll, whose story this is, that one particular night, lying in a hospital, looking at his arms that were, and his legs that were in traction, and his arms that were all bandaged up, looking at all the wounds that he had on his body, there was a moment when all of a sudden he realized, Jesus knows what I'm going through right now, because He's been there too. And suddenly things began to change. And Aaron began to make a journey of faith in his mind. And he remembered his prayer, God, put me someplace where You want me. And so Aaron began to devise a plan. The men in the gang, because the cop had seen them, were easily identified, and they were all indicted, brought into the court, facing charges of attempted murder and a variety of other charges. All gang members were there. And came time for the court to basically wrap up its case. And after the defense and after the prosecution had delivered their final closing statements, Aaron stood and he asked the judge if he could have a moment. And the judge said, I think you have earned that right. So Aaron stood and he looked at the members of the gang, and then he looked back at the judge. And he said, Your Honor, I'd like for you to do me a favor. I would like for you to find these men not guilty. I would like for you to acquit them and not just let them go, but let me serve their time. The courtroom was hushed. The judge was stunned, and he looked back at her and he said, well, young man, that's awfully noble. I can't believe you're actually saying that. Aaron said, well, Your Honor, I think you probably know the story. What I'm offering to do for them, Jesus did for me. The judge went on to explain to Aaron that according to the legal system, that was not something that he could do. The men in the gang were found guilty, and they were sentenced to several years in prison. What began to emerge out of this dark, horrible situation, though, was a ministry that Aaron began in the prison. He had a connection with one of the gang members who was truly astounded by what he did. And he began with that gang member. And one by one, he began to influence these young, troubled men for Jesus. And without realizing it, through this horrible situation, God gave Aaron a powerful ministry in one of the darkest places on earth, where he was able to shine the light of God. All because he dared to be God's champion. I'm absolutely confident that while you may not equate yourself, you may not say that you are like Job, some of you are going through some horrible times right now. There are some of you, I'm confident, I know it, there are some of you who are going through some of the worst trials of your life right now. I know it. I'm also just as assured that if you're not, then enjoy the peace and quiet. As my grandfather Phillips used to say, don't look around the corner because you just might not like what's waiting for you there. If you haven't gone through horrible trials, Just hang on. Just hang on. So, oh, wow, that's just real positive today, preacher. That's just great. Thanks. I'm going to walk out of here feeling great today. You know, I feel as though authenticity is something very, very important. For me to stand up here and say, you know, everything just works out wonderful for all of us all the time, most of you would think I was bananas. You'd probably think that anyway. Or just being completely disingenuous. I do have good news. That even in the middle of our difficult times, whether we're going through them right now or they're still waiting for us, in the middle of all the trials that we're going through, we can cling to the confidence that God has not forsaken us. Say, yeah, but you know, Job was blameless. I know what I've done. I've really jacked things up pretty badly. Yeah, but here's the thing. In Christ, God has said to us, I love you with a love that is unconditional and has no limits. Even if you mess up royally, I am still on your side. And like the line in the song that we sang, you can see a light that is coming for the heart that holds on. And there will be an end to these troubles. But until that day comes, still I will praise you. Still, I will praise you. And can you imagine the joy we bring to the Father's heart when we look around and having no reason to believe, still believe? Wouldn't it be awesome if God could say, have you considered Steve? Have you considered filling your name? God is on our side. And He has confidence that we can be His champions. Now the choice is ours. Will you bow your heads?